Once, long before history had a name for itself, the Mediterranean shone like a jewel. Across its endless blue, sails swelled with the breath of prosperity. From the palaces of Mycenaean to the golden shores of Egypt, from the bustling ports of Ugarit to the high citadels of Hattusa, the world was connected by bronze, trade, and ambition. Ships carved silent paths between kingdoms, carrying copper, tin, and dreams. Languages blended on the docks, spices and stories crossed from one shore to another. This was the age of abundance, when gods were honored, temples overflowed, and kings believed the sea itself bowed to them. But beneath every calm surface, there is a tremor waiting to rise. And one day, without warning, the waves began to whisper something new. They came from the horizon, dark sails against the dawn. At first, no one knew their names. They had no homeland carved on any map, no treaties, no lineage. Only the sea claimed them. And when they came ashore, they brought not trade, but fire. Cities that had stood for centuries began to fall. Ugarit, gone in a single night, its last letters frozen mid-sentence. Hattusa, silent, abandoned. Mycenaean, its palaces emptied, its walls cracked like old bones. The world that once shimmered with connection now burned with disconnection, a chain reaction of collapse, swift, merciless, unstoppable. The survivors wrote of them in fragments. They came from the sea. That was all. A phrase etched in desperation, the only clue left behind by those who saw them with their own eyes. Who were these people? Exiles of famine, warriors of vengeance, or perhaps the last survivors of a world already dying, driven by hunger, fear, or destiny? No one knows. The ocean does not tell its secrets. It only buries them. And so, an entire age was swallowed by the tide, leaving behind broken walls, scattered bones, and unanswered questions. The world's first global civilization, gone, like a flame drowned in water. Yet even now, when the sea is quiet and the air is still, it's said you can almost hear them, the whisper of oars cutting through time, the echo of voices that refuse to fade. Because history is not made only by the victors. Sometimes it's carried by the waves. And this was only the beginning, the first shadow before the fall. Before the storm, there was balance. 1,000 years of rising kingdoms and shared seas. The Mediterranean, not a barrier, but a bridge. Its waves carried not only ships, but the breath of civilization itself. Across its surface, an invisible web stretched from shore to shore. Egypt's pharaohs traded gold and grain for cedar from Lebanon. The Hittite Empire sent iron and horses to distant kings. From the Aegean, the Mycenaeans sailed east with jars of olive oil and pottery painted with spirals, symbols of life and eternity. And on the coast of Syria, Ugarit thrived, a city of scribes and merchants, where letters and languages flowed as freely as wine. The Bronze Age was humanity's first global age, a shimmering network of diplomacy, faith, and exchange. It was a world that believed it had mastered itself, and in many ways it had. Envoys crossed borders bearing gifts instead of weapons. Kings wrote to each other as brothers, to my friend, the great king of Egypt. Their letters, pressed into clay, still speak to us across millennia. Tales of marriages, alliances, and trade agreements sealed beneath the same sun that warms our world today. It was a time when every city, every empire, was part of a delicate pattern, a pattern so vast and beautiful that none could see how easily it might tear. Because this web of prosperity was fragile. It relied on cooperation, on trust, on the endless rhythm of ships bringing bronze, the metal that defined their power. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, charcoal from the forests, All must meet in perfect harmony. A single broken link could shake the entire chain. And yet no one imagined it could truly break. After all, it had held for centuries. Empires rose and fell, but the sea always carried life forward. It was unthinkable that the same sea, calm, generous, glittering, could one day deliver ruin. Still, the first signs were already forming, whispers of unrest in distant lands, drought creeping silently across the fields, trade routes narrowing, caravans vanishing, letters unanswered. And far away, beyond the known horizon, ships moved, unseen. But in this moment, this fleeting golden age, humanity believed in its own endurance. Temples stood high, songs filled the markets, and the world glittered with the illusion of permanence. No one could yet see the shadow rising beyond the light. No one knew that the very connections that made their world strong would soon become the cords that pulled it apart. Because every empire that reaches too far, every civilization that grows too comfortable, forgets one truth, that nothing built by human hands lasts forever. And so the sea waited, silent, patient, and full of secrets. Soon the first tremors would begin, and the golden web would start to tear. Beneath the shimmer of the Bronze Age world, there beat a single metallic heart. Bronze, the alloy of empires, a fusion of copper and tin, so simple in essence, yet powerful enough to forge history itself. From the deep red mines of Cyprus came rivers of copper, gleaming like captured sunlight. From the distant mountains of Anatolia and beyond came veins of tin, rare, precious, almost sacred. When the two met, they gave birth to the metal that armed armies, built cities, and crowned kings. Bronze was not merely a material. It was civilization's pulse. Across the Mediterranean, ships became its arteries. Sails swelled with the promise of trade. Waves carried cargo that glittered like treasure, destined for palaces and temples. In Ugarit's harbors, merchants counted ingots by the glow of oil lamps, their ledgers marked in clay. In Mycenaean, blacksmiths hammered the molten blend into blades that would conquer or defend. And in Egypt, the pharaoh's craftsmen shaped it into mirrors, shields, and divine symbols that caught the light of Ra himself. Every hammer's ring, every spark from the forge, was a heartbeat of the world's first global economy. But like any heart, it could falter. Because bronze was not infinite. It relied on distance, on trust. A missing shipment, a failed harvest, a raided caravan, any small fracture could send ripples across the entire system. Empires depended on one another more than they realized, their fates woven into the same fragile web of trade. In Cyprus, miners toiled deeper into the earth, searching for veins that ran thinner each year. In Anatolia, tin caravans grew slower, their routes more dangerous. Pirates waited along the coasts, storms scattered fleets, and whispers spread that the gods themselves were displeased. Still the kings pressed on. Because power demanded bronze and bronze demanded faith in the system, a system built on distance, diplomacy, and the sea. To lose that chain was to lose the world itself. We like to think of ancient times as simple, but the Bronze Age was anything but. It was complex, interconnected, and astonishingly modern. Every kingdom's strength depended not on isolation, but cooperation. Every weapon that guarded one empire was forged from the hands of another. The same roots that carried wealth could also carry ruin. The same seas that brought prosperity could one day bring invaders, and somewhere perhaps the first cracks had already begun to spread through this heart of bronze, tiny fractures invisible to those who depended on it most. For now, the forges still burned, the ships still sailed, and the people still believed that the rhythm of trade would never stop beating. But history has its own currents, and when they shift, they do not ask permission, because in every age, what sustains us most can also be what breaks us first. And soon the world that glimmered in bronze would begin to hear the sound of something else, a quiet tremor, deep beneath the foundation. The world that once glittered in bronze had begun to tremble. Not from war, not yet, but from something deeper, older, and utterly beyond human command. The earth shifted. The skies changed. And slowly, quietly, the foundations of the great empires began to crack. Across the Mediterranean, the rains that once nourished golden fields no longer came. Seasons faltered. The sun burned hotter, the rivers ran thin, and harvests turned from abundance to dust. Where green once stretched across the plains, only brittle stalks remained, whispering in the wind like ghosts of what once was. In the highlands of Anatolia, earthquakes tore through cities that had stood for centuries, shattering temples and homes alike. In the Levant, locusts darkened the horizon. Even the mighty Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, began to fail its rhythm, its flood arriving weak, uncertain, as though the gods themselves had turned away. The letters of kings tell the story best, once written with pride, now trembling with fear. My brother, they begin, the ancient word for alliance, but we are starving. The grain ships have not come. The people cry out. The gods are silent. Clay tablets carried across deserts bore desperate requests for food, for soldiers, for hope. Ugarit pleaded with Egypt. Hattusa begged for grain from its southern allies. Even the proud Mycenaeans began to fear the silence between their ports. Trade slowed. Ships vanished. And with them went the certainty that the world would always remain as it was. Nature, once humanity's ally, had become its quiet undoing. The empires that had mastered the art of trade, of bronze, of empire, had no answer for the shifting winds. What use are palaces when the people have no bread? What worth is gold when the fields no longer yield? The gods, too, grew restless in the minds of men. Temples overflowed with offerings, incense rising like questions that no one could answer. Priests called for rituals, kings for sacrifice, anything to turn back the tide of change. But nothing worked. The skies remained silent, and so fear began to take root, invisible, yet infectious. Rulers turned inward, protecting their own cities, hoarding what they could. Trade routes became dangerous. Trust faded. The golden web that had once connected empires now began to unravel, thread by thread. In the stillness between letters, between kingdoms, something was coming. Something no one yet named. But the signs were everywhere, in the dust of the fields, in the hunger of the people, in the trembling of the earth beneath their feet. The world was warning them, and still they did not see. They believed the gods would intervene, that the cycle would turn again, that prosperity would return with time. But time was no longer theirs to command. Because when nature rebels, civilization remembers how small it truly is. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the dark unknown of the sea, a different kind of storm was forming. One not of weather, but of people. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than words. One such silence lies buried beneath the ashes of a city once called Ugarit. For centuries, it was a jewel of the Levant, a harbour of trade, a hub of writing and language, a meeting place of gods and men. Its docks overflowed with ships from every horizon, Egypt, Cyprus, Mycenae. Its scribes etched letters in clay, shaping the earliest alphabets the world would ever know. And within its walls, life moved with the rhythm of prosperity, merchants shouting prices, children chasing in the sun, priests singing praises to Baal and El Ugarit, believed it was eternal. But eternity has a way of ending quietly. One night, the scribes were still at their tables, writing letters, not of trade, but of fear. Outside, smoke drifted across the horizon. The sea that once brought wealth now carried something darker, ships with unfamiliar sails. The sound of drums, the glint of firelight, the whispers of panic moving through the streets. One letter remains, baked into clay before it could ever be sent. It reads, "The enemy is at the gates. Our city is destroyed. Our gods have turned their faces away." The tablet was found centuries later, lying among the ruins, half buried in soot. It never reached its destination. It never needed to, because that night, Ugarit ceased to exist. The fires came swiftly, devouring wood and stone alike. Temples cracked under the heat. Ships burned where they lay in the harbor. The air filled with ash, screams and prayers, fragments of a world dissolving in the flames. And when the sun rose again, there was no city left to greet it. For generations, no one would rebuild. No one would claim the ruins. The streets, once alive with trade and laughter, became a graveyard of memory. Only clay tablets remained, silent witnesses, their words preserved by the very fire that destroyed them. Those fragments, we glimpsed the last thoughts of a civilization: fear, confusion, disbelief. They did not understand what had come for them. Perhaps no one did. Were these invaders the same mysterious sea peoples who struck at other shores? Or was Ugarit simply caught in the wake of a much larger collapse, a wave of desperation that swept across the ancient world? History cannot say for sure. All it tells us is this: Ugarit fell in a single night, and with it, an entire chapter of human brilliance was turned to ash. The city that once connected continents became a name carved in ruins. Its language, the first alphabet, would survive, but its people would not. And so, what was once a center of communication was silenced forever. But the story of Ugarit is more than a tragedy. It is a reminder that no matter how advanced, no matter how enlightened, every civilization builds upon fragile ground. And when the foundations crack, even the brightest light can vanish in a heartbeat. Yet, in that vanishing, history leaves echoes, fragments waiting to be found, stories waiting to be told. And as the smoke of Ugarit drifted out to sea, it carried with it the first true whisper of a far greater mystery. The storm was spreading, and soon no shore would be safe from the waves to come. There is a silence that comes before every storm, a stillness so perfect it almost convinces you the sky will never break. In the final years before the collapse, the ancient world stood at its height. Mycenaean's palaces crowned the hills of Greece, their lion gates standing proud against the sun. In the north, the great city of Hattusa ruled from its stone stronghold. Colossal walls coiled like a serpent around its heart. And in Egypt, temples gleamed in the desert light, their pillars carved with stories of gods who promised eternal order. Across the Mediterranean, life flourished in rhythm. Ships came and went, markets swelled with color, and the air was rich with the scent of incense and trade. The people believed in stability, in cycles of power and peace that had lasted for generations. To them the future was secure, anchored in the strength of their gods and the permanence of their empires. But history has a quiet cruelty. It allows the living to believe they are safe, even as the tide begins to turn beneath them. The Mycenaeans, fierce and proud, built palaces of stone and gold, never imagining they would one day be empty. In Hattusa, scribes recorded treaties with Egypt, the first peace pact in history, while their borders, already weakened by famine, began to fray. And in Egypt, the pharaoh's court sang hymns to Ra, unaware that the light of their empire had already begun to fade. Everywhere, signs of strain were already visible. Drought crept across the lands, tightening its grip with each passing season. Earthquakes shattered coastal towns. But the people, the merchants, the priests, the kings, chose not to see the warning. They mistook the stillness for strength, the silence for peace. From the high citadel of Mycenaean, one could look out across the Aegean, a sea glittering like glass. No one knew that beyond that horizon, unseen ships were gathered. Parsin. New forces, desperate and restless, were already moving, carried by hunger, by hope, or by fate itself. For now, the world sang its last songs of glory. The clang of bronze echoed in the forges. Priests raised their arms toward the heavens. Kings sent letters sealed in wax, still speaking of trade, still believing the web would hold. And the sea, the same sea that connected them all, waited in silence. It had watched empires rise before, and it would watch them fall again. Its waves carried the weight of what was coming, a movement too vast, too chaotic, for any one nation to stop. In these final peaceful days, humanity stood at the edge of its own illusion, a civilization so certain of its mastery that it forgot the oldest truth of all, that nature, time, and chance bow to no king. The wind shifted. The air grew heavy, and far away, on the rim of the known world, shadows stirred across the sea. Soon, they would have a name, whispered first in fear, then in legend. But for now, the world slept, bathed in the glow of its own brilliance, unaware that dawn would come bearing fire. On a sun-bleached stele in the heart of Egypt, strange names appear, carved deep into stone: Sherdan, Shekelesh, Teresh. Those who came from the sea. The words are simple, yet they carry a weight far beyond the letters themselves, the first whispers of a tide that would change the world. The Egyptians recorded them not as friends, not as travelers, but as a looming threat. These were shadows moving on the horizon, faces unknown, intentions unreadable. And yet, through the carvings, we feel the fear and awe of those who first glimpsed the coming storm. A warning, etched in stone, preserved across millennia, speaking across time in silence and shadow. Who were the Sherdan, the Shekelesh, the Teresh? Names that sound like echoes of distant seas, of islands and coasts far from the Nile. Perhaps they were raiders, perhaps migrants, perhaps a mixture of both, people swept up by the restless currents of the Mediterranean, drawn toward Egypt by hunger, ambition, or survival. The Egyptians could only record what they saw. Ships appearing like shadows on the horizon, warriors with strange weapons, strangers moving with a rhythm unknown to the land. Each name on the stele is a fragment of a story they could not fully understand. They were the first shadows of a storm no one yet recognized, the beginnings of a wave that would ripple across kingdoms, cities, and generations. And yet, for all their mystery, they left traces. Pottery from foreign lands, fragments of armor, hints of languages that traveled with them. The stones of Egypt preserved their names, but not their voices, not their stories. It is a silence that intrigues, a whisper that invites us to imagine the lives of those who moved between worlds, carrying the unknown on their ships, their oars cutting through the same waters that still glint beneath the Mediterranean sun. History is rarely patient. It allows us glimpses, pieces, fragments, pieces of a puzzle that may never be complete. The first shadows remind us of this, that even as empires flourished along the Nile, forces beyond their understanding stirred in distant seas. These forces were ephemeral, elusive, and yet they left a mark, small but enduring, like the faint imprint of a wave on the sand before it recedes. Perhaps that is why we are drawn to their names, etched in stone so long ago. Sherdan, Shekelesh, Teresh. Not merely enemies, not merely strangers, but harbingers. The first signals of a world in motion, of tides and currents that would reshape civilizations. They remind us that history is alive, not fixed, that even shadows carry meaning, even silence can speak. And in those shadows, in the ripple of waves yet to arrive, we sense the beginning of something larger, something unstoppable, a story that will unfold far beyond the banks of the Nile, across seas and centuries, into the tides of memory and myth that still whisper to us today. The Nile had always been Egypt's shield, its waters life-giving, its delta wide and welcoming, its rhythm eternal. But in the 12th century before our time, those same waters became a battlefield, and at their mouth the fate of an age was decided. The sea peoples had come. Wave after wave of ships, their prows carved like beasts, their sails white against the burning sky. They came not as raiders this time, but as nations on the move, men, women and children, all seeking new lands, carrying with them the fragments of fallen worlds. And standing in their path was Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. He had seen what they had done elsewhere. He had read the messages, desperate letters from kings now turned to ash. The Hittites had fallen. Ugarit was gone. Mycenaean burned. And now Egypt, the last great power of the Bronze Age, stood alone. The pharaoh prepared for war not just with swords, but with foresight. He knew the invaders would strike by both land and sea. Along the coasts he set traps, archers hidden among the reeds. At the delta he built walls and waited, not for trade, as Egypt had done for centuries, but for survival. And then they came. The first ships broke the horizon like a dark tide. The wind filled their sails, and their cries carried across the water, strange, harsh, unstoppable. But the Nile knew its people. Its currents turned treacherous to outsiders. The sea people's ships, heavy with warriors and hope, were drawn into chaos, their formation breaking as the Egyptian archers released a storm of arrows. The river became a furnace. Fire arrows struck the sails. Ships burned, their reflections trembling on the blood-red water. Spears and shields clashed in the shallows, and the screams of battle mixed with the roar of the flames. Bodies drifted where lilies once bloomed. The invaders who had conquered kingdoms now met. A power older than any empire, the river, and the land it fed. By the day's end, the Nile ran quiet again. Egypt had triumphed. The sea peoples were broken, scattered, defeated. Their dream of conquest turned to ash. Ramses III stood victorious, the last pharaoh to bear that title in its truest sense. But even victory carries a price. Though Egypt survived, something within it had changed. The temples still stood, the monuments still gleamed in the desert light, yet the pulse of empire had begun to fade. The wealth, the trade, the great bronze connections that once tied the world together were gone. Egypt's triumph was real, but it marked the end of its golden age. The sea peoples had not just come to destroy. They came to close a chapter, to turn the page on an era that had reached its end. And as the smoke cleared over the delta, the last of the ships sank into the sea, carrying with them the ghosts of 1,000 lost civilizations. The Bronze Age had drawn its final breath, and in its silence, something new was waiting to be born. A darker, simpler world, built from the fragments of all that came before. For even in defeat, the sea peoples had changed everything. They were not just the storm, they were the turning of the tide. They stand frozen in stone, warriors from another time. Broad-shouldered, bare-chested, their faces lost to erosion, but their presence unmistakable. They wear horned helmets, carry round shields, and hold blades of foreign design. Across temple walls and crumbling reliefs, they march eternally, a mystery carved in granite. The Sherdan, the Peliset, the Denyen, names without faces, faces without origins. Who were they? Even the Egyptians, meticulous chroniclers of their enemies, could only record fragments, phonetic echoes of names spoken in strange tongues. They came from the sea, Ramses wrote, from islands and coasts unknown to the Egyptians. They fought with courage, discipline, and unity, not as marauders, but as soldiers. Perhaps that's why Egypt feared them, and also admired them. The Sherdan appear first, fierce mercenaries with curved swords and horned helmets. They fought against Egypt, then for it. Ramses II himself recruited them into his royal guard, entrusting them with his very life. Enemies turned allies. It's almost poetic. The empire that survived them could not resist their strength. The Peliset came next. Their name would echo through time, reshaped as Philistines. They would settle in the lands of Canaan, building cities of stone and iron, blending their seafaring past with new traditions. Archaeologists would later find their pottery, their weapons, their art, proof of a people who adapted, survived, and thrived long after the chaos had ended. And then there were the Denyen, a name that drifts like smoke across history. Some believe they came from the Aegean, perhaps even kin to the Danaans of Homer's Greece. If so, then the sea peoples may not have been outsiders at all, but the disinherited children of the very world they destroyed. Each name is a shard, a sliver of identity glinting through the dust of time. But when you try to assemble them, the picture remains incomplete. They appear suddenly in history, fierce, coordinated, unstoppable, and then fade into silence. No homeland, no records. Only the marks they left behind on others' stories. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show them in vivid battle. Ships colliding, spears raining down, men falling into the sea. Yet even in defeat, there's something eternal about them, as if they knew that while empires burn and names are forgotten, mystery endures. Perhaps they were refugees, a coalition of peoples displaced by famine and disaster, bound together by necessity. Or perhaps they were conquerors, warriors who saw opportunity in chaos. In truth, they may have been both. Survivors and destroyers, creators and endings, woven into one tide. History likes to draw clear lines, victors and vanquished, heroes and villains, but the sea peoples defy such simplicity. They are the twilight between ages, the bridge between the bronze and the iron, between order and collapse. They remind us that identity is fragile and memory selective, because for all we've uncovered, the names, the weapons, the ruins, we still cannot say who they truly were. Were they lost nations seeking home, or the storm that ensured none could find one again? Their faces are gone, their voices silent, but their presence lingers, etched into the stone, whispered by the waves, waiting for someone to listen. And beyond their mystery lies an even greater one, not what they destroyed, but what was born from the ashes they left behind. The world remembers them as destroyers. As the faceless storm that brought the Bronze Age to its knees. But what if the sea peoples were not a plague upon civilization, but its orphaned children? Picture it, the world they came from already dying. crops failing, cities starving, kings abandoning their thrones, earthquakes tearing the land apart, the sea growing strange and unpredictable. The mighty empires, Hittites, Mycenaeans, Ugarit, one by one, slipping beneath the tide of history. And in their ruins, people fled. Families, warriors, farmers, and sailors, all bound by desperation, carrying what little they could. They took to the sea not as conquerors, but as the last survivors of a collapsing world. They built fleets from the bones of their homes and sailed toward the unknown. To those who awaited them, they were monsters. Their ships appeared without warning, their weapons gleaming, their banners foreign. They burned ports, toppled cities, and vanished again into the horizon. To the Egyptians, to the Canaanites, to every kingdom that saw their sails, they were raiders. But to themselves, perhaps they were simply looking for land. Imagine the choice: to starve in the ashes of your homeland, or to fight for a new one, even if it must be taken. In that choice lies the truth of the Sea Peoples. They were both plunderers and pilgrims, victims and villains. A tide of humanity caught between extinction and survival. The line between chaos and hope blurred with every battle. For some, conquest was necessity, a way to feed their children, to start again. For others, it was vengeance, the fury of the displaced unleashed upon the world that had abandoned them. Empires fall loudly, but people fall quietly, and the Sea Peoples were the echo of that silence. When we call them pirates, we speak with the language of the conquered. When we call them refugees, we speak with the voice of compassion. But the truth lies in neither. They were both the destroyers of the old world and the seeds of the new. Archaeologists find traces of them scattered like footprints across time: Aegean pottery in Levantine soil, foreign graves along the coast of Canaan, weapons forged in styles that never belonged to one place. It is as if they blended the world as they broke it, a collision of cultures that would, centuries later, become the foundations of the Iron Age. Perhaps they never meant to end an era. Perhaps they only meant to survive it. But survival, when stretched to its limit, can look like war. And history, written by those who endured, rarely spares sympathy for those who arrived too late to belong. The Sea Peoples remind us that destruction and rebirth often share the same breath, that those who flee ruin sometimes become its messengers, and that in the story of collapse there are no pure heroes, only those who endure and those who fall. So were they pirates, refugees? Or something else entirely, something we still cannot name? Perhaps they were simply the reflection of humanity itself, fierce, fragile, and forever searching for home. And as their ships faded beyond the horizon, the world they left behind would have to face a harder truth, that the age they ended was already ending on its own. Once, the world was a web of light. Cities glimmered like stars along the coasts: Ugarit, Mycenaean, Hattusa, each shining with its own brilliance, yet bound together by trade, diplomacy, and faith. But stars, no matter how bright, eventually fade. And when they do, the sky grows quiet. The collapse did not come in a single moment. It came like dusk, slow, creeping, and inevitable. A century of strain, of hunger, of shifting tides and trembling ground. Each city thought itself safe until it wasn't. Ugarit was the first to fall. The flames consumed its harbour, and silence followed. Letters lay unfinished, still damp with clay. Desperate words never sent. Then came Hattusa, the fortress of the Hittites. Its massive walls, once symbols of endurance, stood powerless against famine and rebellion. The empire fractured from within, its people scattering like dust across the Anatolian plains. To the west, Mycenaean's great palaces echoed with emptiness. The stone lion still guarded its gate, but behind them, only ashes. The halls where kings once feasted were now home to wind and ruin. Even the once mighty Greece of myth, Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, fell into shadow. The bards would keep their names alive, but their cities would vanish beneath the soil. Everywhere the signs were the same: trade routes abandoned, temples looted, the forges that once rang with the sound of bronze, silent. The great network that connected the world unraveled strand by strand until there was nothing left to hold it together. It was the first global collapse humanity had ever known. Not the fall of a single empire, but of an entire age. From Egypt to Anatolia, from Crete to Canaan, a silence spread. Not the peace of triumph, but the quiet of absence. For centuries, historians would search for answers. Was it invasion? Was it drought? Was it rebellion or disease or fate? Perhaps it was, as all of them. Each thread pulled loose until the whole tapestry came undone. Imagine standing among the ruins in the years that followed. The roads, empty. The ports filled with broken ships. The writing, forgotten. Generations born who no longer remembered how to read the clay tablets of their ancestors. The very art of memory itself, lost. This was not just the end of cities. It was the end of connection. The shared rhythm of the ancient world, gone. And yet, amid the silence, life continued. Fishermen still cast their nets. Children still laughed in new villages rising beside the ruins. Humanity, though scattered and scarred, endured, as it always has. The Bronze Age had burned away, but from its ashes would come something different. Simpler, rougher. Iron would soon replace bronze. New gods would rise where old ones had fallen. And the stories of the past, distorted by time and myth, would echo in the foundations of the next age. Civilization had learned its first great lesson, that progress is fragile and memory is mortal. The cities had fallen silent. But silence too has a voice, a whisper that says, nothing lasts forever. And beyond that whisper, far to the west and across the still changing sea, a few survivors were beginning to build again, from ruin, from memory, from hope. Because every end leaves behind the faint outline of a beginning. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. The empires were gone, their cities hollowed out, their gods silenced beneath the dust. And yet, amid the wreckage, life began to stir once more. Out of the smoke and ruin came those who refused to vanish. Among them were the Peliset, once part of that great wandering tide the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. They had fought, lost, and survived, and now they began to build. They settled along the southern coast of Canaan, on lands still warm with the ashes of the Bronze Age. There, they raised new cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Names that would one day echo in the scriptures and stories of another people. Their origins were scattered like fragments across the sea: Aegean pottery in Levantine soil, foreign gods carved beside local ones. Their art carried the spirals of Greece, their language borrowed words from Egypt, and their architecture blended the memory of islands they could no longer return to. They were neither wholly foreign nor entirely native, a people born between worlds. The Peliset, or as later generations would call them, the Philistines. For centuries they would stand as both neighbors and rivals to the tribes of Israel, their names forever entwined in stories of kings and prophets. To history they became symbols of defiance, the outsiders at the gates. But their true story was not one of villainy. It was one of endurance. They were not conquerors anymore. They were survivors. The descendants of wanderers who found new meaning in foreign soil. They sowed crops where the land allowed it, forged iron when others still clung to bronze, and rebuilt what the sea had taken. They adapted. And in doing so, they became something new, not remnants of a dying world, but architects of the one to come. The world around them was also transforming. Egypt, weakened by victory, withdrew into itself. Trade began again, cautious but determined. And across the Mediterranean, small villages were rising where palaces once stood. Civilization was beginning to take its first, uncertain steps into a new age. The Bronze Age had ended, but the Iron Age was being born in its shadow. And like all rebirths, it carried both memory and loss. When we uncover the ruins of those Philistine cities today, we find a culture in transition, pottery that tells of travelers, tools that whisper of reinvention, and walls that speak of resilience. Every fragment is a reminder that even in collapse, humanity finds a way to begin again. Perhaps the Sea Peoples were not just the agents of destruction history paints them as. Perhaps they were also the bridge, the living thread that carried fragments of one world into the next. The Peliset, the Philistines, their story is not one of disappearance, but transformation. A testament that from ruin, identity can still take root. Because history's ashes do not simply mark an end, they are the soil in which new worlds are planted, and as the smoke of the Bronze Age cleared, the first seeds of the Iron Age began to grow, small, uncertain, but unstoppable. The sea had taken much, but it had also given something back, a reminder that life, no matter how broken, always finds a way to return. The seas remember them long before the ink of history dared to write their names. Who were these wanderers, these warriors, these shadows on the waves? Mycenaean exiles fleeing the smouldering ruins of their palaces. Tribes from the rugged valleys of the Balkans pushed outward by famine and fear. Or perhaps something more elusive, a coalition of displaced peoples, bound together not by crown or country, but by the unyielding instinct to survive. The truth refuses to settle. It scatters, like broken pottery across the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian walls record their battles in rigid hieroglyphs, yet speak only of enemies, never of lives, never of dreams. Archaeology teases hints. A shard of pottery, a strange symbol etched in clay, a forgotten coin. But these fragments, beautiful and fleeting, offer no final answer. They are history's mirage. One moment they surge with fire and fury, toppling gates and cities. The next, they vanish into silence, leaving only footprints in sand and echoes on the wind. Their fleets, sleek and formidable, cut across the Mediterranean like the spine of some great, restless beast. Yet, beyond the battle, beyond the raids, there is poetry in their movement. A rhythm shaped by currents, by tides, by the eternal call of survival. Some scholars trace their lineage to the glittering halls of Mycenae, to palaces now reduced to smoke and stone. Others look northward, imagining families uprooted from mountain valleys and river plains, crossing unfamiliar seas in search of refuge. Still more whisper of alliances so fleeting, they left no trace beyond the scars on walls and the memory of fear. And yet in their passing, they left a mark, subtle, enduring, almost imperceptible. Foreign pottery in Levantine soil, weapons shaped by distant hands, names etched in hieroglyphs that hint at voices lost to time. Every fragment, every relic, is a whisper, a pulse of lives that refused to be erased. They were not merely destroyers. They were travelers, survivors, carriers of worlds that had ended, yet refused to vanish. Perhaps that is the essence of the Sea Peoples, a reminder that history is never tidy. It does not always answer our questions. Sometimes it offers only glimpses, shadows, the glint of metal beneath dust, and the haunting suggestion of lives once lived, now almost forgotten. They invite us to wonder, to imagine, to feel the tremor of history not as a series of events, but as currents of motion and survival. They ask us to consider the lives of those who drifted between worlds, shaping and being shaped by the tides, carrying fragments of one age into the next. And in their silence, in the mystery of what they were and where they came from, they leave us with a question more profound than any answer. How many stories, how many peoples, drifted across the oceans of time, leaving only shadows behind, waiting for us to find them? They had no kings, no chronicles, no homeland to call their own. The Sea Peoples sailed through history like smoke across the horizon, visible only in the reaction of those they touched, the civilizations they disturbed, the ruins they left behind. Their story is written not by their hands, but by the hands of others. Egyptian scribes recording battles in meticulous hieroglyphs, Levantine villagers whispering of ships that appeared like shadows on the waves, distant cities noting the scars of fire and steel. Every account carries bias, perspective, survival instinct, the voice of the observer, never the observed. And yet, even in absence, there is presence. The echo of their lives lingers in the soil and stone, pottery fragments scattered along foreign coasts, weapons half buried in silt, strange symbols carved in fleeting strokes. Each fragment is a pulse of a story never told, a life unrecorded, a voice lost beneath the tide. They were wanderers without roots, travelers without certainty. Their ships carried people who had lost everything, kingdoms, families, lands, and yet found the courage to move forward, to face the unknown. Every raid, every landing, every fleeting settlement was an act of survival, a desperate attempt to carve meaning from a world in chaos. We see them only in contrast, the smoke they leave behind, the fortifications they breached, the relief carvings of pharaohs celebrating victory. They appear as shadows, faceless, nameless, yet undeniably alive in their impact. In that silence, there is a strange poetry, a haunting reminder that history is not always about the conquerors, the chroniclers, or the kings. Sometimes it is about the vanished, the overlooked, the voices that never reached parchment or stone. Somewhere beneath the waves, under layers of mud and time, their stories wait. Ships rotted into sand, treasures claimed by the sea, Sihen, settlements lost to rising tides, all holding the remnants of lives that refused to be fully captured. And yet, even in absence, they speak, not with words, but with presence, with the way the sea shapes the coast, the way ruins hint at ambition, fear, hope, and survival. Perhaps that is the lesson of the Sea Peoples, that history is not always recorded in ink, but in echoes. That survival is sometimes louder than chronicles, and that absence itself can be a story. They remind us to listen differently, to read between the lines, to feel the traces of lives lost to time, to imagine the unspoken journeys of those who shaped history without ever leaving a record. And so, as we search for their voices beneath the waves, we realize that some stories are meant to be reconstructed from fragments, from shadows, from the rhythm of the tides themselves. The Sea Peoples may have left no words, no kings, no homeland, but in their silence they leave a question. How many voices have been lost to history, and what truths might we uncover if we dare to listen? Maybe history's greatest cover-up isn't what was hidden, but how easily we stopped looking. The truth does not vanish. It waits, patient, quiet, beneath the waves, beneath layers of sand and time, beneath the confident narratives we tell ourselves. The sea peoples left no chronicles. They left no kings. And yet, their memory is etched in the ocean itself. Shipwrecks swallowed by tides, settlements forgotten beneath rising waters, treasures claimed by mud and silt, all relics of lives that once surged with hope, fear, ambition, and survival. The sea is a keeper of secrets, a vault of echoes, a mirror of the world we think we know. Divers search beneath the blue expanse, tracing the contours of what once was. Bronze and iron glint dimly beneath centuries of sediment, fragments of vessels and tools that speak of journeys unfinished, of lives disrupted by storms and war. And in each artifact lies a whisper, not of conquest, but of passage, of people moving, surviving, leaving traces of themselves in places they could not truly call home. History often privileges the visible, kings, scribes, empires, but the invisible is equally vital. It lives in what we overlook, the scratches on stone, the patterns of pottery, the alignment of sunken walls. The past persists in absence, in silence, in the subtle ways the world reshapes itself around what has been lost. Perhaps the sea peoples understood this better than anyone. They moved like shadows, leaving no permanent footprint, yet altering the world around them irrevocably. Every coastline they touched, every city they challenged, every life they touched, these were the markers of their existence, subtle, ephemeral, almost invisible to the casual observer. And still, we are drawn to their memory. Archaeologists sift through centuries of sand and debris, scholars puzzle over hieroglyphs, and storytellers imagine the lives of those who drifted between worlds. In every fragment, in every echo, there is the sense of motion, of continuity, of survival. It is a reminder that history is not just what was written, but what endures, patiently waiting beneath our feet, or, in this case, beneath the waves. The sea carries their stories like a memory suspended, not fixed, not fully knowable, but present nonetheless. It reminds us that time does not erase, it buries. And what is buried still shapes the world above, influencing trade, culture, migration, and imagination in ways we cannot always see. Perhaps that is the lesson of the lost voices beneath the waves, that disappearance is never total, that survival can be measured not only in life, but in the first shadows of the sea peoples may have been distant names on stone, echoes across the Nile, whispers of a world in motion. Yet even these fragments remind us that history is never silent. It waits patiently for those who dare to listen. If you've journeyed with us today into the mysteries of the past, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to Mysteries of Earth, share this journey with fellow explorers, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of history's hidden tides. Because the past is full of whispers, and there are many more waiting beneath the waves.